Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. Now in this essay I'd like to talk about the misinformation, the lies, the propaganda, the deceit around slavery, and particularly at the moment there's various Black History Month commemorations going on, and just looking through the postings and documents around that, it's hard to pick up any of or look at any of them without finding them riddled with inaccuracies, half-truths, removal of context, outright lies. The outright lies are certainly in preponderance. So it's clearly propaganda. The intent is propaganda. It is willful evil propaganda, and it's being pushed on us. It's being shoved in our faces as if it's fact, which it is not. It's taxpayer subsidized. Our white politicians, under the control of the globalists, are directly funding this propaganda, and it's to create social division and be used as a club to beat on whitey, whether it's in the school classroom or in the universities or in the newspapers or in the media or in the documentaries. It is thick wall-to-wall lies and bullshit. Now, let me just qualify that there's a few things that when I say omission by context, for example, there'll be a line that'll say, and the white slave ships took the blacks from Africa and then sold them on the white-owned slave market and in wherever. But what they're removing in the context here, that these black slaves were captured by blacks. They were not captured by whites. They were captured by blacks, and these blacks were selling their fellow countrymen or fellow citizens, or even members of their own tribe for that matter, but mostly members of other tribes, and selling them to the ports, which are often owned by other blacks or Arabs, and then the white slave ships would carry them to the Caribbean or the United States, and then many of these, of course, would be sold to black-owned slavers. So what they do is they admit that the blacks have captured the black slaves. They admit that the slaves will be sold to black owners. They also admit other things, like they claim that the overcrowding in the slave ships meant that sometimes close to the entire number of slaves on the ship would die. Now, the only way that these slavers and the ship owners could make any money at all was if a lot of slaves arrived in full health, in top health and top condition, ready to start work. And the more that died, or the more that was sick or ill, then the less likely they could make any money. And these people, if anything, wanted to make money. So this idea that they were arriving with a ship full of dead slaves is absolute nonsense. But that they spread or put this myth about. So that's omitting the context or by omission. Now, another example would be when it's declared that a ship in the Caribbean, they'll start with something inflammatory like, and slave owners were known to kill their slaves without cause, and 61 slaves died on the ship bound for so-and-so. So by phrasing it and placing it that way, you say, well, gee, the slave owners, the ship guys on the ship, the white guys must have killed the slaves. That must be so you presume that from the ways, but in fact that ship went down in a storm with all the slaves and all the white crew on board. Everybody died and went under, and some wreckage washed up on a shore or sometime later, and that's how they knew the ship had gone down. So they omit these sorts of things, but the rest are outright lies. As I say, all this history is absolutely thick. It's shot through with lies. Now, a couple of things that we need to sort of look at. Slavery's been around since human habitation. Now, we see slavery today as very much a race issue. It's absolutely inflamed with race politics and race division and so on. And the Marxists, the Soviet Union saw this was a rich opportunity to create social division in the West, and they went for it. In fact, even Soviet agitators used to come to Sydney, it's in Australia, and they'd spread the most fantastic stories that half the population of the Soviet Union is black because all these black Americans have left America, and they've gone to the Soviet Union, and there are tens, hundreds of millions of them in the Soviet Union because of all the freedom and the equality that they get. I mean, obviously outrageous untruths, but you can see in the 70s and 80s that Soviet agitators were running that nonsense around town and all over the West as far as they could, putting bullshit stories in newspapers and sending agitators into university to spread this crap. So it's got it's got Marxist roots in that sense, at least. But coming back to the concept, slavery, as we see it today, infected with bitter race politics, was never that way. But slavery, as in going back to the ancient times, was seen as a method of solving a labour shortage. So it would be you would go and grab people who are going to be workers because you needed workers in your village or your city or your area. Now, at times they would grab pretty young boys and pretty young girls to sell to the harems, but that was for the Arabs. They're the ones that had the harems, and the Barbary pirates were big on that. They're also Jewish slave traders who are very active in and around what today is northern Germany and Holland, and they specialised in delivering young, fair, blonde, blue-eyed boys and young girls to the harems of the Berbers in at the time southern Spain and also in the North African coast. So this idea that slavery is something new and a white invention is utter nonsense. I mean, it's beyond nonsense, and yet it's not mentioned. It's treated as exclusively a white issue. Now, the whites didn't really get involved in slavery until, and the Portuguese and the Spanish being sort of first, until the late 1400s, early 1500s. That's when it started to sort of the involvement of whites, or in this case Mediterraneans, and it was as they were acquiring the empire in South America. Again, it was a labour shortage. They simply didn't have the labour, nor did the whites able to take the diseases and so on of the areas that they were owning plantations in. So the black workers were resistant to European diseases, white diseases, and the diseases that they found on these new areas where they were putting the plantations. So it was just by accident. Had the blacks not been able to cope with either or both of those diseases, then they never would have been picked as a labour force. But going back through time and across the British Isles and so on, that was how you did it. You grabbed people to work in whatever industry or any town or village. So sometimes if you'd had like a plague had gone through the place and you're down to a small pool of people to procreate, they would even get slaves to come in and use them as fresh meat for procreation and that sort of thing. So there was that, but it was never seen as a race, never seen as a race issue. It was always seen as a labour issue, a work issue, and getting work done. Now, sometimes they would capture slaves for a specific period and say, well, effectively it's an indenturement for 10 years or something like that, and then they were free to go. Sometimes slaves would stay on and marry into the family. Sometimes they become husbands and brides for the children and offspring of the family that may have hitherto owned them. So again, nothing to do with race or actual ownership of an individual. That individual had to stay for as long as the owner, unless it was an agreed period, as long as the owner said so. And if you look at indenturement, slavery became indenturement later on. So effectively an indentured servant was, to all intents and purposes, a slave, or certainly as we would view it today. For the time of the period of the indenturement, they were the property, in effect, or their labour. Their labour was the property of the owner. So slavery was very much, it wasn't a race thing, and it wasn't infected with race politics or eugenics or anything like that. It was just a labour issue, and so that's something we really need to come to grips with, and something that isn't mentioned today. In terms of slavery, the white people came very late to the game. Slavery had been going on for thousands of years, so the white people didn't really get involved in any serious way until, this is the North European whites, until sort of the 1600s, early 1600s, and it was all over in a couple of hundred years. So in the timeline that slavery or labour, the labour sort of issue went on, which was for thousands of years, the whites took up 1 or 2% of that timeline. So this idea that it's uniquely white or that it's a white issue is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, and it's just an outrageous lie to say otherwise. In terms of the treatment of slaves, there's a lot of stories go around that slave owners beat the slaves to death and beat them to the point where they were crippled and handicapped and so on. Well, I don't know how this works. If you've got a plantation and you're getting workers on the plantation and you go and kill them all, who's going to do the work? I mean, that's utterly absurd. So you had to have as many fit working slaves on the ground doing the work as were needed, particularly things like planting time and harvesting time and things like that. So this idea that there was across the board brutality and evil whites against helpless black, that too is absolute and utter bullshit. So the thing that annoys me about the slavery take is how it's deliberately stacked to hate on whitey. That's the problem I've got. If there was a few rounding off errors or there was a couple of sloppy dates here or there, you go, oh, well, who cares? But this is deliberately written and deliberately cast, deliberately set up to be used as a blunt instrument to beat white people over the head with. And they're having to use the most terrible lies, the most terrible untruths, and all sorts of just fantasies. They're just making up fantasies about the so-called wickedness of whites, and it's simply not true. Don't believe it. And if you talk to anybody, you're discussing with anybody, you get them to the history of it. Now, I've had exchanges with one YouTuber, and he came up with, well, okay, so other people did do slavery, but whites had more slaves than the other guys. So it's a relative badness. They were bad, but whites are just a little bit more bad. So I had to point him to the fact that Arabs have been capturing black slaves for more than well over 1,000 years before whites ever got involved. So that was, directed him and gave him some links. He had a look at those, and he came back and he accepted that. But not everyone's like that. Very few people were. They're taking fixed positions. Whitey bad, black good. Slavery was, but slavery as an idea of a subjugation of a race was never what slavery was about. It was always a labour issue. If you have any takeaway from that, then from this live stream, then at least take that away. But do your own research. Don't accept the Black History Month bullshit, because it is most outrageous pack of lies, and it needs to be exposed for that. And why our white politicians would fund it and promote it and push it through our schools is quite beyond me. Must be because they're owned by the globalists. You've been with Tastus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.